to part 3 of hand laying a point. I thought I'd get straight into the track laying this morning on moving right along, and as things are working out quite nicely, I can't see a lot of point in delaying by rabbiting on to the camera. But there were a couple of quick things I wanted to mention before we get started. The first one was a friend of mine contacted me after part 1 of this series was put onto YouTube, and he told me that my workbench was too neat. So to Glenn, get lost, alright? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was that I neglected to mention in the in part 2 that I'd actually screwed this track base to the lane jig at the back here. Part of the reason for that was because 2 sections that I'd filmed and couldn't go back and refilm because I'd gone past that point then came out onto the off the camera with no sound, and I'm hoping that there will be sound for this part as well. So what I did was I simply drilled holes, 3 holes along the centre line, one at the end, one in the middle, one at this end, which I know you can see, and put a small brass screw into that section. Now the screws I use come from a hardware store. They are 2 different lengths, but they're gauge 4 screws. They're supposed to be brass, but they're actually only brass plated, and you can tell that by the fact that they're magnetic. But anyway, they're plated in brass. The reason I'm using the brass ones is because the smaller screws I could get were brass screws, just readily, and you just buy them from a hardware store. So there's nothing special about them. But as I think I might have mentioned, the method I'll use to secure the point in place in its final position on the layout on the 12mm track base I use, or the sub road base I suppose you'd call it, is these brass screws. So these screw holes will come in handy. I'll probably add to them by putting another one between these rails here, and I might even add one down this end towards the heel of the point, but generally speaking those screws are in ideal locations for where I want them to be. I've laid or spiked the rail at this end. I've spiked the rail down at the other end, which you can't see at the moment, but at the other extreme end I've spiked this little exit rail here, and I haven't yet, but I'm about to spike this rail here. After I've done that, I'm going to test a bogey through these sections here, because I'm of the opinion that there's not a lot of point in moving on to the next section of track laying or building something, whether it's a model or a piece of track like this, or a model you're building, a loco, a wagon, anything. There's not much point in moving on to the next section until you've solved the problems of the current section. You don't solve them by moving on to something else, you solve them by thinking and working through them. So if I will run a bogey just through this section here and I get a nice smooth ride, I'll move on and I'll then pin this track from here to where the point motor will sit along this section here, and then I'll file the switch rails and install them, paint and install them, and that's essentially what this part of the video is going to be about. It's going to be a little bit of track laying, but a little bit of testing, but essentially these sections of rail. The last part of the video series was quite long, I think over 50 minutes. I'm hoping that this section is going to be a little bit shorter. So let's get started. Okay, so what I did off camera, or between this scene and the last part of the last video, was to finish spiking the curved stock rail, pin in these little wing rails or exit rails here, and fiddle around with the gap between the frog and these rails. So these rails are essentially complete now. They're finished and ready for installation. The next create the switch rails. Now these are the pieces that I cut earlier. They're not painted yet, and the reason they're not painted is because before you do anything else, you need to form the flat switch end down this end of the point. I haven't cut them to length, tried to cut them to length or change anything about them, but if you may be able to see that that end piece is going to sit just right in there, hard up against that little notch we ground in the rail when it's finished, and it's going to curve round to there. I've got a good 3 sleeper lengths of material over the length I need, because it will terminate just in front of the frog. And the reason for that is because the reason I've given it quite a bit of extra material is because by the time I've cut this away, there'll be a little bit missing from this end in terms of length. So it's much better to make it overlong, file it, and file the flat section on the switch, and then cut it to length with your rail cutters later. I decided that I was going to go back and have a look at the Fast Track's video on forming the switch rail with this, what they call their point form tool. This has number 6 written on it. It's for code 70 to 100 rail, and it's quite heavy. It's solid mild, I think it's mild steel, and it's made basically from milled steel with 2 cap screws holding it together. Now essentially it's just 2 lumps of steel with 2 grooves cut in them at slightly different angles. It's actually 4, 2 on either side. These sit face to face, and you pick a spot for which type of rail you're filing. The cap screws go through these holes here, and they hold the rail securely to the base. So you slide the rail in, hold it down, and tighten these down. And then when you're ready, get an Allen key and just tighten them down. What you do is you slide your rail into those holes between the 2 pieces. I'm sure I'd probably do this better if I wasn't trying to show you. And the appropriate hole, and then you tighten the bolts down. Now for this one, because I'm doing switch rails rather than frogs, because we've got a cast frog, you need the slightly outside gap. So I've got that in properly. A bit of rail emerges from the side. You need to snug it down. You don't want to crush it. You don't want to crush the rail. You just want to hold it firmly. So that's ready to file. And these are handed, so you will need to make sure that when you come to do the other side, so I'm doing the curved rail with this one, with the outside face being shaved away, you need to do the other side, so you'll need to change it, and they're handed. This is the left hand, if you're looking from that direction. The left hand side, this is the right hand side looking downwards. So, let's move on to forming the switch rail. Now, the tool you use, the tool to be used, is a rather large cross-cut file. Now this has just cuts one way in its face, not the cross-hatched face that sometimes they have. I used to have a very nice file, one I bought quite a number of years before, and then I decided to go and watch the video. And one of the suggestions the man in the videos, the Fast Track videos makes, is to buy yourself a new one. And I went to a hardware store. Being the gullible bloke I am, I went to the hardware store and bought myself a new file. His point was that for the 10 or 15, 20 bucks, you can get a reasonably good crosscut file. 4 is worth the investment for this job. Don't use the old one you've been hacking away at lumps of hardwood for years, or the one your dad owned for 30 years and you never touched until you had to build a new house. Get a new one, and it'll cut through this nickel silver very, very quickly. There's only I suppose one difficult part, if you want to call it difficult, about forming this tool. It's sort of knowing when to stop. That's sort of one of the steps. But the only difficult part is that you start by, and you've got a bit of rail sticking out of the base of this, you start with the easy way. If you're right-handed like me, or if you're left-handed obviously the other way, you start by just filing. Now I would actually be better off without all this gear in front of me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video and I'm going to clear the desk and I'll give you a better view. Okay, now I didn't do anything while I had the camera off. I've just removed all the junk from the table and set the point form tool up where it is. Now the action for doing this job is basically like that. It goes along for quite a while. However, we get to a point where, just getting rid of the chips, we get to a point where we actually need to cross hatch it. So we need to go this way. And for me as a right-hander, this is the difficult bit. But I find, so you go that way, and so you don't wear the tool any more than necessary in the one direction. It's best to hold it with your left hand, hold the tool firmly, and then go back the other way. Now, this left-handed filing is, because I'm a right-hander, I find really difficult. I'm sure the people who are left-handed will feel exactly the same way. However, I can guarantee you that it is worth it. Don't just file from one direction. Take both. That's probably the best way to do it. It's probably the best way from your view. Now, when you start to get close, you'll know. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera off. I'll almost finish this until I get to a point where where I'd like to show you what I'm doing. But that's really all there is to it. There's nothing more scientific than that. Now, there is a point at which you will feel it, and this was described in the Fast Tracks video, that you wonder when do I stop, and you will feel the file skip a little, not damage the point or the tool or anything. It'll just stop cutting into nickel silver, and it will just skip across the surface of the steel, which has a different feel when you file it. I can just feel it starting to skip. I can hear the sound of it as I just get rid of the last vestiges of what's sticking above the surface. And it's skipping there. It just needs a little bit more along the top there. So I make about 10 passes one way and probably about 5 on the other way, which is quite uncomfortable. 5 in the other direction. But the point tool and the point blade doesn't know that you're only right-handed, so it doesn't care. I haven't quite taken enough. I've managed to get it to where it's basically just skipping across the surface. There's almost no, if any, nickel silver sitting above the surface of the point form tool, so it's time to take it out. Now it's bent it, just a tiny touch. I'll get this smaller file. It's bent that, I don't know if you can see that, it's just bent it that way. You just bend it back again. Right. But as it's a curved stock rail anyway, a little bit of a bend's not going to be a problem. But generally speaking, there's normally a little bit of a section at the end where the nickel silver web is quite weak. I'm going to have a look at that in a little bit more close up later. But I think what I'd like to do now is just move straight onto the other rail and get it filed up, and I'll do that off camera. But just remembering that they are handed. Now this one's come from that side of the machine, or the point form tool. So this one will go in this way. You probably can't see that because I've got my arm in the way. So it just goes in just like that, just slide it along, and just until you get past the thing, the gap, and where the machine is grounded into the surface, tighten it down with the Allen key until it stops turning, and then I just give it a across the rail, and it's ready to be filed. Welcome back. Been doing some work on both of the switch rails. Now I've got them sitting in there, not pinned in any way or in their final position, I suppose, but generally speaking in the vague area that they're going to end up. The straight one running here and the curved one running there. I ran the curved stock rail up to the point where the filing starts through my curving gadget from Fast Tracks to give it a bit of a curve, and while that's, again, as I said in the part 2 of this video, while that's not absolutely necessary, it's not something that you couldn't do with your fingers, I still feel that it does a really good job. I want the curve to run from right at the end, right through. I don't want it to be straight and end curve sharply. So that curving gadget is a good thing to have. After filing the straight switch rail, there was a bit of a curve in the rail in the opposite direction that I wanted. I would have wanted a curve, except that I don't want any curve because it's supposed to be a straight stock rail. Now the problem you will find with using the Fast Track point form tool is that they're essentially made for smaller scales than O. While they do a great job of taking off the last, what would I say, the last inch, maybe 3 centimetres of material, they don't take off all the material you need along the inside face of the point. While they don't do a total job on a big point or a big switch such as this, the rest of the material, so it'll take off material from around there through to around here, and then just leave it. There's no more tapering. Because this is such a big point, and because I need clearance for around about 3 or 4 inches, you need to take off a bit more material along the inside. Now the way I do that, you can't use the point form tool. Its job is done now. As you can see, I've taken the point off the laying jig. Is get my trusty piece of scrap ply. This is I think 5mm. It's nice quality ply too. I don't know what happened to the rest of it. And then I'm doing 2 things. Now I've sat here for around 15 minutes probably working on both of these switch rails. I've been bending the rail back especially with the straight one, back into the form I wanted. The end piece actually needs to be bent ever so gently right at the tip. But I don't just grab it and bend it. I very gently do it. Check. By putting it on the point. I've cut both these rails to length, by the way, so it sits just about 1 millimetre short of the frog, and the point of the switch sits in that little notch that we ground. I sit there, hold it in line, and see whether it will sit hard up against the rail. I also use the micrometer. Now this is a digital one. A dial one will do just as good. Doesn't matter what whether it's a metric one or an imperial one, but of course with this one at least I can change from imperial to metric, and I work in metric most of the time because I need to know this is 32mm, and measure across those points, or the 2 points there, and the distance is, well, I need to turn it on if I'm going to tell that. The distance is a bit difficult upside down and not getting in the way of the camera. 32.03 according to that. So, well, it's actually 32.01. So that's almost perfect. And when I say almost perfect, I know it gets thicker here. So what I needed to do, after bending and gently getting it into shape, I need to get a little bit more of the heel off, because the heel is still in existence along the inside as this gradually curves away. The straight stock rail is always a bit of an issue because it doesn't have the clearance that the I should say the curved stock rail, switch rail, is always an issue because it doesn't have the clearance or it isn't running away. So this curved stock rail, while it curves away, there's always a section in here where the part from around about there to about there clashes, and you need to just gently, and I do mean gently, that doesn't sound very gentle, but I'm trying to be, where gently take away material. Now, as you're on the other side of the rail, from where the wheels will run, you can take away a fair amount. On the foot of the rail, probably up to a millimetre. On the head, you don't want to take too much, but if you take a little bit off, it doesn't matter as much. It's the running side that you have to worry about. So you just want to gently and carefully work the back of the rail until, when you check it, put that switch in the notch, run it up to the frog, hold it in place, and if it sits nice and snugly in there without too much bending, you've got it where you want it. Every time you file it, it will bend back away from the file, so you need to go back and bend it again. And there is no replacement in this particular stage, but a little bit of care, a little bit of time, and lots of checking. This isn't measure twice, cut once. This is check 1,000 times, check 100 times, check 100 times, and then pin in place. I can see that that's nice and straight. I've actually notched out a little gap in the heel of the I suppose the foot of the rail there to clear a pin, which is the first pin holding the stock rail in place. This is almost where it needs to be in terms of shaping and forming. It's taken me probably about 20 minutes to get both these rails, both these switch rails, to the point where I'm reasonably happy with them. They're not finished yet. A little bit of filing. You need to file the top as well, just gently. Get all that roughness out. It might even be worth later getting a piece of wet and dry and just ever so gently just rubbing it on a piece of wet and dry. But at the moment, this is almost where I want it. Now, if to you this work seems like tedium personified, that it would drive you insane, then it's probably point building is not for you. I find this quite relaxing. It's as I said in the previous sentence, quite hot here today, and I've been listening to a podcast or an audio book from Audible, and just having a drink. This is not alcoholic. This is blackcurrant cordial. It's 11 o'clock in the morning, so if you think I'm drinking at that time of the day, you're kidding yourself. But anyway, I find this quite relaxing as an activity. But I really think we're getting close. All right, so the next step, once I'm absolutely satisfied that these are where I want it to be and the measurements work and everything is ready, and I need to do the same thing with the curved rail. I've done some of the knocking away of the back of the rail, but it's not quite ready yet. It's quite self-explanatory. You get your roller gauges out. Using the straight, I do the straight one first probably. Get the roller gauges out. Place. Now, even though I'm gauging this and putting the roller gauge this far down the switch, I will only pin to about probably somewhere around here, maybe a little bit further up. I don't attempt to cut the rail and hinge it or anything like that. I find with a nice stiff wire. I don't use the wire with the tortoise machines. I don't use the wire that comes with the machine. I use a slightly thicker wire, probably something up around the 0.9 mm mark. I might have to enlarge the holes just slightly for the fulcrum and that, but I put a piece of tie bar here, 2 bits of tie bar, and a little bit of brass tube over the hole there. But once I'm satisfied that this will sit and there'll be enough gauge between these two rails and I can start pinning, I'll just leave a little gap at this end near the frog, and I'll just pin down the line until I'm happy that there's enough spring in this to allow it to move. I want to go as far as I can because I like this. I want this rail here to remain engaged with the straight stock rail, but I don't want it. I don't want it so far down that the point motor can't switch the switch. It needs to be somewhere in here. I mean, there's no point in telling you a dimension for that. I will pin to around about there. Maybe a little bit further than I need to, and if I find it's too stiff, I'll take a few of the pins out later. It's not something I measure. I'll turn my chronometer off. It's not something I measure. It's something that I just do by feel. It's as simple as that. Now that straight stock rail, as far as I'm concerned, is ready to go in. So I need to start. I can start pinning it. I'll start at this end and pin it at this end here. Move it along a little bit. I'll start pinning at this end. Make sure there's a little bit of a gap for the styrene. If there's not, I'll trim a little bit more off and file a little bit at the end here to make a little bit of space. And then when I'm ready with this one, the curved switch rail, I'll do the same thing. Okay, we've got to the stage where I've pinned one of the switch rails in place, and what I decided I thought it might be worthwhile doing is placing the code 125 point next to the code 100 point again, just as a point of reference. The switch rail on the code 100 point is a nice tight fit against the stock rail. You may be able to see that it actually sits up a little bit. There may be a bit of a bow in the base. That's not really a problem. The way I retain the switch rails against the stock rail when the point is in operation is to solder bits of brass wire in the web here. I'll try and use this as a pointer. To solder bits of brass wire into the web of the switch rail at the back here, and then these go across, then turn to 90 degrees and then turn another 90 degrees down, giving me 4 pins, 2 on this side, 2 on this side. That gives me 4 pins against which I solder a strip of PCB sleeper. Now, the PCB sleeper is a Clover House product. I assume they're HO or N-scale sleepers. I'll get them out and show them to you later. But the fact that this bit of rail is sort of wobbling around doesn't really matter, because I put the sleeper, as you can see from this, I put the PCB sleeper underneath the rail and gap that just slightly with a little piece of paper so it slides nicely backwards and forwards. This will sit beautifully. It's actually, I'm very happy with the way that's sitting at the moment. Just rolling a bogey through the point is a wonderful feeling. It's really satisfying. In deciding how many pins or how many track spikes to place into the rails, into the sleepers I should say, down these switch rails, I very much came to the conclusion that I'd let the feel of the rail determine how many they needed. You may be able to just see on the code 125 point, which is this one further back, that I've got a row of spikes. Every sleeper is spiked for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spikes. For 8 sleepers. So the spiking only goes to here. On this one, I've spiked on the code 100 point, move it a little bit closer to the camera. On the code 100 point, I started with the sleeper underneath the same sleeper as the frog, and spiked every second rail, about 8 as well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, but over twice as many sleepers. I only spiked every second sleeper. Now, I didn't really do that with reference to the code 125 point, I just did it. and I felt, well, I was going to put 7 in, then I thought, no, I'll put 8 in, and I can always pull that one out. But because the Code 100 rail is so much more whippy and lighter than the Code 125, that 0.25 of a 100th of an inch, I assume that is, that 0.25 is amazingly different, or is it a thousandth of an inch? I don't really know. Is a quite a bit of difference, and and I can feel just how light that is in movement. So I'm happy that is enough spikes. If I find that it's too stiff when I come to put the point motor together, I'll just remove those points and those spikes, I should say, and I'll maybe perhaps spike these later over the top of the point in place on the layout. But I can do that later. Once I've got it essentially finished, the switch rail in place, pinned down and in place, the tie bars together here, and the check rails in, the point will essentially be completed, and I'll take it to the layout room and place it in, put it in place. And it's at that point that I can decide, well, I've got too many pins in there, I haven't got enough, or I can adjust it from there. But the fact that I've built it at the workstation, I've been working on this point on and off for about 4 days now. The total amount of time I've been working on it is probably no more than about 4 hours, maybe 5 hours in total up to this point. And it's slowed me down quite a bit actually doing the filming, so that's another reason why it's taken over 4 days. I've been doing other things obviously as well. But the fact that I've been building it at the workbench rather than over the layout means that my neck hasn't been sore. I've taken it fairly easily. I've tried not to bend down right over the top of it. I've made sure that I've given myself breaks and just taken my time with it. I wanted to get it right. But overall, and just in general terms, I've really been happy with the way there's still a little bit of a bump there. I can feel it in the way that goes across, but we'll see whether that's a problem later. In general terms, I've been very happy with the way the points gone together, and working with the Code 100 rail. It's been a little bit fiddlier, but it's also been quite a bit easier than working with the Code 125. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for the moment and spike the curved switch rail in, and then I'll come back and show you how we work on the tie bars. Yes, find that very fascinating and very satisfying. Now, many years ago, when I was a small boy, my mother used to get her hair done on a Thursday afternoon. And every Thursday afternoon after school, I would, during school terms, I would go down to walk out of the school probably about 400 metres away, and meet her or wait for her in the waiting room at the local hairdresser's. She got her hair permed. Now, in those days, the ladies used to get their hair permed, and they used to pin parts of the hair or parts of equipment into the hair with these little clips. Now, somewhere along the line, I managed to acquire 8 to 10 of these little clips, and while some of them are getting a little bit long in the tooth, they still work, and they still serve a purpose. Not to clip hair anymore, but to clip things together like a little clamp. Now, you may have noticed that I now have the check rails in place, there and there. Now, these I discovered were a little bit longer than I wanted them to be. They only need to cover where the wing rail of the frog runs. So this sleeper here and this sleeper here are more than adequate to cover that. And I cut them at about 9 centimetres, and they're now just under 8 centimetres long. So I cut about a centimetre, maybe a little bit more than a centimetre, maybe 11 millimetres off the end of them, and I notched just with a square file, let's say 3-pointed file, a small square file around here somewhere. So a square file with a 90-degree angle on it. I notched the back of those and bent them just gradually, about a centimetre in, maybe a little bit less than a centimetre. I actually used the thickness of the pliers I bent them with as a guide. This is just a little pair of cheap pliers. Once I'd put them in place, or had them in position, I painted them, and then I needed to pack them out. Now, nominally, the back-to-back wheels, the back-to-back of the wheels is 29 millimeters, and 29 millimeters, yes. And that's the critical dimension. So if your back-to-back's a little bit under, that will affect the check rail. You can't have the check rail installed at the nominal distance it needs to be away from the stock rail if it's going to make the as the wheels run through, pop out, because while these need to be, you need to check your back-to-backs and make sure that they are a reasonable distance around about the 29 millimeter mark. The check rails will malfunction, make the wheels malfunction, no matter what you do, if you've got it too close to the stock rail. So if the gauge of the track is 32 millimeters, and the back-to-back is 29, that should give you a nominal distance between the frog and the wing rail, and the check rail and the back of the check. The stock rail and the back of the check rail should be about, the distance should be about 1.5 millimeters. Now I set these gaps here at 1.5 millimeters exactly, which means that any back-to-back closer than 29 on this. So if the wheels are 28.9, 28.8, or anything lower than that, that means if I make this 1.5, those won't get through that check rail or through this point. Sure enough, when I set the when I pack the wheels out at 1.5 millimeters, let me see, I used a piece of styrene which I put back in the box. Now that piece of styrene is 1.56 millimeters wide. Okay, I use that as a packer. When I put the pins in, or the spikes in, the wheels wouldn't go through. Anyway, I got the wheels. I packed it out to around about 1.85 using 3 different pieces of plastic, and the wheels now pass through. Now that 0.35 difference between 1.5. So I'll start the calculations again. 32 millimeters minus 29 leaves you 3 millimeters. The gap here is about 1.5, probably a little bit less at 1.5. That means that has to be compensated for by here. Now these check rails will actually operate as the real things do. That's as the wheels come through, it will pull the wheel back towards the check rail, the stock rail, and make sure it doesn't hit the nose of the frog, which is that point right there. Which is why these are sometimes referred mistakenly by modelers such as myself as points, as if the whole thing is a point. It's actually that is the point there. So this needs to be operating properly, working so that it pulls the wheel back from that thing. Now, there's a lot of slop in fine scale wheels and dimensions, so you've got a little bit to play with. Now, I've made that gap 1.75 to 1.85. It's probably a little, it varies along its length, but generally speaking, by the time it hits that point, as you can see, it runs through absolutely fine. Because not all wheels are created equal, I may have some problems with that. But the one great thing about building your own points is I can pull the pins out, shift it back or forward, and reset it. So, we're almost finished. We have our, little bit stuck. The pins are going just through. One pin has gone just through the, I'll use those two. I'll use my old flush cutters to cut the pin off. I think I've got a pin sticking under the web of a rail there. Okay, so we're just about finished. I have my stock rails in, curved and straight. I have my frog in, exit rails, check rails, and my switch rails. The switch rails sit nicely in that notch that we ground out, and the only job left before the point can be installed, is to install the tie bars. So what we're going to do next is install some brass wire here and get the PCB sleepers out and set that up. Once that is done, the point is essentially finished.